Yeah. Dear ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, it gives me great pleasure to welcome here today at the Academy of Sciences, Vienna. This is actually our first workshop with presence and a hybrid form. Special welcome to those who are participating in today's conference via the live stream. The theme of today is we have these rapid developments of information and communication technologies, and their widespread use are leading to a transformation called digitizations of society as a whole. There have been many buzzwords recently. It started with the broadband networks, mobile services, 5G, social media, cloud computing, Internet of Things, big data, and now artificial intelligence, just to name a few. With each of these developmental steps came the promise of economic benefits, acceleration, and increased efficiency. The improvement of communication possibilities was meant to be a push forward to democratization because everyone could create the content. Consumers should become prosumers. That was one of the expectations. However, if you look at the real developments, you have to admit that many of these expectations and promises have not been fulfilled. And there have been even quite negative developments. So to say, the erosion of privacy, more surveillance in private and governmental form, here coming with the promise of generating more security. Manipulations through behavioral analysis, nudging in the private sphere, predictive policing, and even applications that are particularly problematic in terms of democratic policy, such as micro-targeting and the exploitation of reinforcement of so-called filter bubbles. These bubbles, mutually reinforcing, lead to polarization and therefore have a negative impact on the culture of discussion and debate. So these developments are to be countered with a comprehensive legal framework. The first internationally significant step was the introduction of the GDPR in 2018 as a basic legislation for the handling of personal data and the individual protection rights based on it, in addition to other legal activities, e.g. with regard to law enforcement agencies. The Commission's draft on AI, on the AI Act, is currently the subject of controversial discussion. The different pace of development between technology, economy, politics, and legislation led to a constant need for adaptation. And this is where PANELFIT project comes in. With today's meeting, Managing a Secure Future with AI, Too Many Guidelines and Too Little Guidance, we start a series of concluding events of this important project. The other events will take place in Brussels and Cologne on the 30th of March and in Brussels again on the 31st of March. The first Brussels meeting and the one in Cologne will be fully online. The second meeting on the 31st in Brussels will be hybrid as ours here in Vienna. For further details, please visit the PANELFIT homepage at panelfit.eu. Over the last 3.5 years, the team of the ITER has been working with colleagues from another 12 European partner institutions on processes for new ethical and legal frameworks for ICT. There is a need for society, as I said before, and politics and the economy to adapt quickly to these new conditions evolving from the permanent change in the IT landscape. The PANELFIT project aims to help to shape these processes such a way that innovation opportunities can be exploited without impairing fundamental rights and security. The ITER has been mainly responsible for the topic security and cybersecurity within the project. Thus, PANELFIT fits perfectly into the ITER's portfolio. In addition to its focus on innovation, the environment and sustainable futures, and emerging technosciences, values and uncertainty, ITER has a significant focus on digital technology, democracy, and society. With a long-standing history of studies on privacy and other fundamental rights on the one hand, and security policy on the other, with a widespread dissemination and increase of AI, new challenges are indeed emerging, and this will be also discussed today. In this spirit, sorry for not introducing myself. My name is Walter Peisel. I'm a Deputy Director of ITA. On behalf of ITA and the Academy of Sciences, wish you all a productive meeting and a warm welcome to Vienna again. Thank you.
Thank you, Walter. My name is Jaro Krieger-Lamina. I also work at the Institute of Technology Assessment at the Austrian Academy of Sciences. And we will have another welcome message from the coordinator of the PANELFIT project, Professor Carlos Maria Romeo Casabona from the University of the Basque Country. And afterwards, from Inigo de Miguel Perian, also from the University of the Basque Country, who will explain about the ongoing and the status of the PANELFIT project. Could you switch to Carlos Maria, to the Zoom link, please?
Yeah. So, dear colleagues and friends, and also invited people to attend this dissemination seminar. Good afternoon to everybody. Given that I have academic duties to fulfill at my university at this very hour, it has not been possible for me to be present at this meeting, and I must make do with these brief words of greeting and welcome online. As maybe you know, PANELFIT, I mean Participatory Approaches to a New Ethical and Legal Framework for ICT, is an European Commission funded project by the SWAFT's Science with and for Society program. PANELFIT is integrated of 12 multidisciplinary groups from European countries with expertise in the fields of law, social communication, ICT, and other. It is coordinated by myself with the collaboration of Inigo de Miguel, who acts as associate coordinator, both from the University of the Basque Country here in Spain. When we submitted the application for this project to the European Commission, we were aware that the regulatory framework on data protection was changing dramatically. In fact, it was only recently that the important General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, was approved by the European institutions. Taking into account this important new legal framework for Europe, 27 European countries, we took as a main objective to encourage the creation of data markets that enable fair data commercialization while ensuring at the same time the protection of autonomy through decisive support of individual informed consent, but also supporting the implementation of sustainable security systems, including that cybersecurity. Thus, from the basic idea, we draw the three pillars of the project. The first one, data commercialization. The second one is informed consent. And the third one, security and cybersecurity. Consequently, the four main objectives of PANELFIT, as you know, are: first, to facilitate the implementation of this new regulation by producing a set of outcomes that serve as operational standards and practical guidelines able to reduce the ethical and legal issues posed by ICT, while promoting innovation and market growth, enabling high-quality job creation, and assuring a high level of privacy and security, cyber security. Secondly, to suggest possible concrete improvements to the current regulatory and governance framework for the same purpose. Thirdly, to create mutual learning and support tools and to promote networking among stakeholders and policy makers. And finally, to increase the quantity and quality of the information available to policy makers, professionals, journalists, and lay people. As derived tasks of the former objectives, main objectives, to provide applicable guidelines and recommendations and dissemination activities, among other, are the most relevant activities. After my welcome, Íñigo de Miguel will explain you the main and the most relevant outcomes of PANELFIT along these last years. With this afternoon's meeting here or there in Vienna, we want to continue our activities on these matters as we have already done in Madrid, the last times in Madrid, we will do in Cologne and Brussels, and including also Italy, among other places. Today's topic in Vienna will be managing a secure future with AI. Too many guidelines and too little guidance is the question mark. Before giving way to the other interventions this afternoon, I would like to thank Johan Kaas for having taken charge of the organization of the event and for having been able to convene such a qualified panel of speakers. To them, to the speakers, I extend my welcome and my thanks, my warmest thanks as well. So I will finish my presentation and my words of welcome. I would just like to wish you all an enjoyable meeting, and that all those who wish to participate in agreement with the organizers can do so in order to make the meeting as fruitful as possible. Thank you very much to all of you, and enjoy the meeting. Bye.
Thank you, Professor. Íñigo, please go on with the presentation about the PANELFIT project.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jaro. Can you hear me well?
I'm fine, thanks.
Yeah. So first of all, let me apologize that I'm not there. In any case, I really hope that we will meet at some point in the next months. Especially, I must tell personally that I am especially thankful to the team of ITA. It's been an enormous pleasure to work with Jaro, with Johan, and with Walter. Really, I mean, we all know that it's been a long time now, almost 3.5 years, and we have been together, you know, in some very good times, in not so good times, in all type of times, I guess. And it's been really a pleasure and a honor to work with you. So I'm really delightful to somehow be able to at least recognize that. And so once I'm telling you that, I also must, you know, congratulate you for this panel. I know the speakers and really, you know, the type of people that I would have choose if I were me to decide. So you did it. That was fantastic, and really thankful for that. Congrats. So I will just introduce a little bit what we have done in the PANELFIT project. Please take my word, it will not be more than 10 minutes. So I will try not to be so boring, okay? Because you have a very, very interesting things to do. So I'm just trying to share my screen right now. And I guess that you should be now seeing my screen. Yeah, I think that's the case. So we'll just put it that in a presentation mode, that you're feeling the whole of the screen with that. Yeah. So Professor Romeo has already introduced the PANELFIT project. It's all about data protection issues mainly. And you know from the very beginning that this was aimed to a quite simply to understand goal. I remember when we were just first starting with the drafts of the proposals, just working together, especially with Johan and with Björk, our Danish colleague, that we were just thinking how to deal with something like so that was as impressive as the data protection regulation and so on. Well, at the present moment, we are not only having this General Data Protection Regulation, but also the Artificial Intelligence Act and the Data Governance Act and the Data Act out there somewhere. So everything is gonna become even more complicated. So what we tried to do during these years really was to try to make things a little bit easier, both for those policymakers who had to introduce these new materials and for the end users that will really have to deal with that. So in the PANELFIT project, we are just creating something that is kind of set of outcomes. I dare say 6 main outcomes that have been produced during this project. And I will try to introduce them quite briefly. First of all, and this is very well known by my Austrian colleagues, a critical analysis. A critical analysis is it's a document that it's mainly a report that it's considering what we have right now, how the regulatory situation is, and how this could be improved somehow. So we were just analyzing what we have and introducing some kind of proposals. Most probably some of the things that we were saying in this report will be incorporated in the next months or in the next 2 years with the new regulations. We don't really know, but I think that most of our suggestions are really somehow there. Some others not, of course, but at least we are just pointing out some possible solutions that could really make things better at the regulatory level. So this is the first that we have, that is a critical analysis. Then we have a report on governance. I think this is gonna be a very interesting report and will become the more important in the future. I don't know what Christine is gonna say in the next presentation. I'm really looking forward to hearing that. But in my honest opinion, one of the things that really will be very difficult and something that we will have to deal with is the supervisory bodies that will have to deal with artificial intelligence and data protection, and data governance in the next year. So in this report, we were more or less just stating what was the current situation, what was the role to be played by the ethics committees. And this was really a very interesting document produced by EREC, that is the European Network of Research Ethics Committees. So they were just trying to tell us how they were dealing with this and what could be done to improve the current situation. Then we have the next one, that is a code of conduct. We were proposing, and we are proposing in PANELFIT, a code of conduct that could serve well for those who are dealing with data protection issues. And this might be useful in 2 different ways. Somehow it could become an official code of conduct when we are trying to push for that, because you know that the GDPR allows for a kind of official code of conduct. But even if it were not, if it does not become a real official code of conduct, we will have something like a code of conduct for responsible research and innovation in the specific field of ICT and so on. And this could be very helpful, especially taking into account the new regulations and the EU regulations regarding some minimal risk tools and so on. So this could be somehow useful for them, or could be. Then we have the handbook for journalists. That is a very interesting outcome that we have produced. This was really based on a kind of idea that we had in mind, is that journalists use a lot of data. It's essential for their profession, and usually they are not so well aware of what they can do and they cannot. And on the other side, we really need journalists to do the work in a best possible way, because somehow those are the ones who are protecting us in so many ways and providing good information. So we were just helping them to do that thanks to this kind of handbook for them. And then we have a citizen info pack. That is quite some materials that have been produced to help citizens understand the rights and how they could really make their best use of the data and feel protected. And we especially developed a special version that was adapted to vulnerable population, and we are completely quite proud of that. And finally, maybe, but last but not least, and in this case it is really last but not least, one of the most important outcomes is what we call the guidelines. Guidelines is a very, very important thing that we have that has to do with something that really means providing a practical advice for those who are dealing with this. So here you get a kind of an impression of the guidelines in the PANELFIT project produced by us. This is a very interactive tool. You could take a look at that if you wish. The link is there and it's publicly accessible. And this contains lots and lots of information about the GDPR and how you could deal with that. So for example, you take a look at the left column, you Chapter, the main concepts, the main principles, main actors, data subject rights, and so on. So if you just pick one of them, you will receive the information about what it is, the different rights, and so on. It's been created in a way that some windows open, so as whoever is using that can perfectly know what this is about precisely. And there are also lots of check boxes just to make it very practical and easy for them to understand whether they are really accomplishing with the regulation or not. And of course, we have created that with accessibility tools, so as when you could increase text, decrease text, or do whatever you feel more comfortable to you. So this is more or less the outcomes that we have. I will just come back for a second just to give you something very simple information about communication and dissemination and the things that we have done. Lots of different things. We have created, of course, academic papers, panels, and workshops, and all the rest, but we have also introduced some more courses, both to end users and to researchers and so on. We have had encounters with lots of stakeholders and policymakers, and we are also creating this series of final events. That this is one of them, of course. But another thing that we are quite proud of is that we have a lot of impact, social impact, thanks to lots of publication in El País and El Mundo, Corriere della Sera, and so on. And especially and particularly, I would like to add that we are especially proud that we think that we really provide nice advice on data protection issues and public health in the context of COVID, something that I think it was really helpful in so many ways. So that's more or less what I would like to tell you. There are some more things that you could look in our webpage, but I think that this is more than enough. So just let me finish at this concrete moment. Thank you again, everyone, for coming here, for your attention. Thank you so much for my Austrian colleagues. Really appreciate you all, man. Thank you so much for all your help during this project. And the floor is again yours. Okay, thank you so much. I will remain here, just of course, keeping an open eye to the next presentation. I'm willing to hear. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Nico. Now, my colleague Johan Chas is giving a short introduction into the topic of our event today.
Okay. Thanks to Walter, Carlos, and Inigo for the warm welcome, the introductory words, and brief presentation of the PANELFIT project. Thanks also to the keynote speakers and the participants of the panel discussion that follows. And, of course, to everyone who accepted our invitation to this event in person or virtually. What is it about this afternoon? As already mentioned, the PANELFIT project is looking at ethical and legal challenges of emerging information communication technologies, with security and cybersecurity being one of the three focal points of the PANELFIT project. I will move to the theme of today, managing a secure future with AI. Too many guidelines, too little guidance. Security is a multi-layered, changing, and often contradictory concept. Within the framework of this project, these 12 issues, which are shown on the slide, were selected in a participatory process for the area of security and examined in more detail. As you can see, they concern very different levels and topics, which still could be supplemented or expanded in many ways. And the relevance of individual aspects can change rapidly. As a result of the Russian Federation's invasion of Ukraine, for example, questions of military security and thus, for example, the delivery of intelligent drones have taken on a significance that was unimaginable until a few weeks ago. Nor could it have been foreseen that a pandemic would change our lives so dramatically that we will need masks and certificates to participate today in person. The issues identified range from fundamental disputes, such as the relationship between security and surveillance, to freedom and privacy, from individual, societal, economic, and political aspects of specific and to specific applications. Today, we will not aim to find valid answers to all of the questions raised in the project or to newly emerging ones. The domains involved are too complex, the perceived threats too diverse, and the answers to these questions correspondingly complex and contradictory. We must therefore inevitably limit ourselves to certain aspects and at the same time try to do justice to the diversity of the concept of security. Technical progress in ICT allows or entails that more and more functions and areas are permeated by them. The accompanying possibilities of surveilling our lives, our actions, our interests, our preferences, bring with them corresponding losses of privacy. AI technologies are a key means of analyzing the vast amount of data and thus also a common tool to address many security issues. That is why this afternoon we want to focus on the relationship between AI and fundamental rights. If data is the oil of the 21st century, then AI technologies are also the engines for harnessing that data. One of my central theses is that in order to avoid the dramatic consequences of the use of fossil energies for the natural environment and for global warming, we must do everything we can to avoid a repetition, to prevent data from polluting the social climate, from surveillance leading to a global chilling of individual and societal freedoms. We see how ICTs are used to heat up the political climate, how they are utilized to aggregate economic power and generate corresponding dependencies, how social networks can lead to personal isolation, how automated decisions threaten to undermine human autonomy, and how freedom of expression is threatened. A second thesis would be that the development and use of AI technologies in accordance with fundamental rights is one of the central prerequisites for progress that is not limited to higher performance and the improvement of technical capabilities, but serves human needs and social advancement. If we agree with these theses, they raise a number of further questions. To what extent might existing regulations be sufficient to ensure the development and use of new technologies in accordance with fundamental rights? If not, are these regulations insufficient or not enforced strictly enough, or both? And as already said, the draft AI Act has provoked very different reactions. The initial enthusiasm that non-binding recommendations are finally, for the first time ever, to be cast into a body of law has given way to increasing skepticism. Does this draft act bring about an improvement, or does it represent even a step backwards compared to the GDPR? And not, of course, the general question, how can ethics, law, and technology be combined to achieve a secure future without restricting fundamental rights? I would like to end here, and I'm very much looking forward to the two keynotes and exciting discussions afterwards. Thank you, and here you can also find again the link to the project and to its reports.
Thank you, Johan. I have the pleasure to introduce our next keynote speaker, Professor Charles Robb. Professor Charles Robb is at the moment Professorial Fellow of the School of Social and Political Science at the University of Edinburgh, having held the chair of government for the years from 1999 to 2007, and later for the years from 2012 to 15. He has served as a member of the academic staff since 1964 and has held visiting positions in the Oxford Internet Institute, the Tilburg Institute of Law, Technology and Society, the Queen's University, or the Victoria University of Wellington, just to name a few. He was a fellow of the Hanse Wissenschaftskolleg in Delmenhorst, Germany, and currently he is a Turing Fellow at the Alan Turing Institute, where he also is a member of the Data Ethics Group. With colleagues of the Universities of Stirling, St. Andrews and Essex, he is the director of the Center for Research into Information, Surveillance and Privacy, and he is the founder of the Scottish Privacy Forum. He is a fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences, as well as a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts. He was the specialist advisor to the House of Lords Select Committee on the Constitution's current inquiry into the impact of surveillance and data collection upon the privacy of citizens and their relationship with the state. He is also co-chair of the Independent Digital Ethics Panel for Policing, and his actual research interests at the moment are mostly into public policy and governance, including British government, information policy, privacy protection, and public access to information, and information technology in democratic politics, government, and commerce. At the moment, he is also working at a research project named PATH AI, which is the acronym for Mapping an Intercultural Path to Privacy, Agency and Trust in Human AI Ecosystems. And I'm very glad to greet you here from Vienna to Edinburgh. And yes, please, Charles, start with your presentation.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? I'm very sorry that I can't be with you in Vienna, which is one of my favorite cities, but I haven't been able to be there today. So I hope this is an acceptable substitute. I'd like to see if I can share the screen just now. How do I do that? I think I'm not being very successful with this, and I wonder whether my slideshow, which I have here, can be, oh, here we go. Let me see.
Yeah, that's good.
Can that be seen?
I think we see your desktop now with the open PowerPoint presentation.
You can see it now?
Yeah, we can see your slides.
Good. Do you see the whole slide, or do you see something else on the right?
It's not presentation mode, but we see the slides in the PowerPoint.
Yeah, let me see if I can adjust that. I'm not sure where I go to do that. Here we go. No. Is the whole slide visible, or do you see pictures of the members present?
No, we see the whole slide. It would be okay if you go on like this.
You see the whole slide. Okay, that's fine then. Okay, I was very interested to hear Christian's talk, and I think that although we are dealing with some of the same kinds of issues, I'm putting it in a somewhat different perspective and moving it away from looking at the law to looking at ethics and other practical aspects of the, not so much the GDPR, but also the AI proposal, the AI Act, and other similar or related proposals that have become available. And so let me move my next slide. Oh, how do I move my next slide? There we are. What I'm focusing on today are three broad areas. The ethical background of these documents, GDPR, AIA, and looking also at other recommendations, including UNESCO's. And then what I want to do is to focus particularly on security and safety and the way in which they relate to regulation and the way we think about the regulating the technologies and so forth. My presentation draws upon a couple of articles that Hilke Hiemans of the Dutch Data Protection Authority and I have published in recent years. I'm not going to talk about those papers. You can have them available and look at them if you wish. Also, I should say that while I have rather a lot of slides with sometimes rather a lot of text on them, it's not intended to be, I'm not intending to speak to all of the slides or all of the written text. But I thought it was be worthwhile to have a complete slideshow so that anybody wanting to have that available and read it later on after this PANELFIT event, you're welcome to have that. First, I want to ask some very, very general questions. When we talk about law and ethics and what the relationship is between them, there are many different things you could say about them. Are they separate domains, separate dimensions, or are they somehow interwoven? And if they are interwoven, in what kind of patterns? How do they relate to each other? Could ethics be seen as soft law and conversely law seen as hard ethics? Because in the law, you have a substantial ethical content, normative content, which has roots in ethics in a more formal sense. And then when we talk about law in this area, are we only talking about statutory law? Are we talking about general law, like a general data protection regulation, or a specific law like the AI Act, or indeed company law, as we've heard addressed in the previous keynote, company law and technology-related law and so forth. So it isn't simply law, but particular facets of law that one might want to look at. And then comes the question of, must ethics necessarily mean self-regulation? There are a lot of people who criticize ethical approaches in this area because they think, oh, ethics is simply a matter of companies wanting to regulate themselves and let themselves off the hook very, very lightly. And I'm not sure whether that is the beginning and the end of ethics. And then the last question we might want to ask is, how do ethics relate to human rights? One sees in recent years an emphasis upon human rights, fundamental human rights. And when you talk to people who are promoting that, and you say, well, what about ethics? And they say, well, ethics is one thing, human rights is another thing. Well, is that necessarily the case? So I'm not going to answer all of those questions, but those are some things that we might want to ponder about. If we talk about individual rights, individual rights are there not only to protect the individual, but I would contend that they are there to protect society as a whole. They are full of societal values that society would be poorer without having. If you can look at privacy or data protection as not just an individual thing, but as a socially crucial, constitutive set of rules, which are maybe underappreciated in formal written law. They constitute public good, and we should be talking about the public good and public benefit. An example of this is that if data protection is very weak, it's a disincentive for people to give accurate and up-to-date and full information to the public services, to doctors, to hospitals, to the census, to official statistics, and so on. And therefore, the quality of public service data is compromised if people don't have confidence in the protection of their personal data. So there is a kind of social dimension to having good data protection law and practice. Another example is the accuracy requirement in Article 5 of the GDPR, which underpins the right to rectification of one's data held by a company or a public sector organization, and therefore to help to increase the quality of those data. And another example is the general assumption that public trust and confidence will be enhanced for the data-driven economy and data-driven society. Now, we may be ambivalent about whether that's a very worthy goal, but there we are. And questions one could ask is the individual rights route to societal values, in other words, going through something like the GDPR in order to get to societal values and benefits, is that a too indirect route to safeguarding society and safeguarding fundamental rights? Can they be realized more directly through reliance to some extent upon ethics? Well, let me look at ethics both before and beyond the GDPR. There's been a recent, as we all know, a recent turn to ethics with a great proliferation of ethical codes of practice, 80 or 90 of them, ethics advisory processes, ethics groups, greater awareness of data ethics and principles. A lot of talk about ethics. Now, there are critics and there are supporters of that turn to ethics. The critics would say, this is all ethics washing. It's all blah, blah, blah. It's all formulaic. It's all pious. It's very powerless. It's cosmetic. It's vague on what ethics means, and it ignores fundamental rights. Some critics also say this is simply reputational risk back covering by organizations who jump on the bandwagon in order to protect their reputations rather than genuinely to alleviate risks and prevent harms to the general public. And the critics also say how it's very unclear how ethics relates to legal requirements and what ethics would impose upon or forbid to people who say, well, we are simply following the law and the law is good enough for us, so go away. What do the supporters of ethical approaches say? Well, they say that ethics complements and underpins, but doesn't substitute for legal rules. And that it shows that there is a thoughtfulness, a ferment in the thinking, a reassessment of practitioners getting to grips with the extra legal implications of their innovations and of their practice, and that it encourages thought about how you solve wicked dilemmas, and it moves away from simply liability-related compliance routines that companies would like to take, even though they don't necessarily like to comply with the law, as we also know. Supporters also say that ethics points to societal dimension of these things, as I've mentioned, and not just individual rights, that the law is too complicated and vague and also inadequate to go directly to those rights. Well, in the GDPR, I don't want to go into this in too great detail, but there's recital 4 about the processing of personal data should be designed to serve mankind. And here we have all kinds of very, very good words in recital 4 of the GDPR: respect for private and family life, the home and communications. I won't read the rest because you know all of them. They're about freedoms and the right to a fair trial and cultural diversity and so forth. And these are mostly ethical, they're enshrined in the law, but they're ethical norms and ethical values. They aren't simply invented by lawyers without any cognizance being taken of the ethical underpinnings of them. Also in the GDPR, there are elements of principle-based regulation and not just rules-based regulation. But the ethical considerations are, as Hilke Hiemans and I have written, are sometimes obscure and hidden away in various articles, and I'm not going to go into those. The ethical considerations are concealed, and they're not always apparent. They're intermittent, they're fragmentary, you have to find them and hunt for them in all the recitals and in all of the articles. And it seems that the GDPR could have drawn from a wider range of ethical principles, which I think in the years since the GDPR was being drafted have now come more closely into focus concerning human rights, for example. If you look at the European Charter of Fundamental Rights, the term human dignity only is mentioned once, and that's only once in the GDPR, in Article 88, where it has to do with processing in the context of employment. Now, that's a very, very limited way of referring to human dignity by simply only putting it into provisions for processing in employments. By way of contrast, the European Data Protection Supervisor, the late Giovanni Buttarelli, was very, very keen on human dignity as a mainspring for the work that he was doing and how it could be perhaps inserted into the ecosystem of data protection more forcefully. And perhaps we see things like human dignity coming about a bit more forcefully now. Well, what about the idea of fairness? And this was mentioned a while ago. That's an ethical dimension which is central to data protection laws, but what is meant by fairness? I'm not going to go into that point, particularly at the moment, but as you will, I'm sure know, fairness is being debated, it's being worked on mathematically by computer scientists and data scientists to kind of cash in the wonderful word of fairness into some usable techniques and tools for producing fairness in algorithms or in other kinds of outputs from artificial intelligence. Now, some of the recitals and the articles in some of the recitals and also Article 51 elaborate on fairness, and they associate it with transparency. Well, you could argue that transparency, yes, is part of fairness, but it also is a standalone requirement on its own. So the relationship between transparency itself and fairness is something that I think needs to be smoothed out. You find that transparency or openness and accountability have come on very strongly as important principles and as important practices and rules in recent years. And both transparency and accountability address the ethical and the practical relationship between controllers and processes of personal data on the one hand and individuals on the other. So that's a kind of ethical drive that we find in the GDPR, such as it is. Well, let's move a bit from the GDPR to the AI Act. Now, if the GDPR renewed and strengthened the legal rules and related ethical precepts, and also gave it a wider geographical reach and helped to reform regulatory machinery, the AI challenges many of the norms and values and the laws that were framed only in terms of data protection or privacy or with regard to personal data. And it's questionable whether the adequacy of concepts like data protection and privacy and personal data, whether these are still adequate concepts in the regulatory and governance ecosystem that has evolved and that is further evolving in the context of artificial intelligence and algorithms and derived profiling, as Christian was pointing out. The AI Act exemplifies a further turn to global, ethical, moral, human rights, legal thinking in specifically with regard to AI. If you look, for example, at the GDPR, the European Commission's high-level expert group on artificial intelligence of 2019, which came about after the GDPR was done and dusted. The turn to ethics, of course, is very manifest in that. Is also, if you look at projects and reports by the Fundamental Rights Agency, the FRA, if you look at the Council of Europe, the OECD, UNESCO, my own, the Alan Turing Institute and others, ethics is very much front and center in terms of advanced artificial intelligence applications. I'll mention something about some of those initiatives in a little while. So there's now, yet again, a further profusion of frameworks and principles and documents which enshrine ethical things. And if you want to be cynical, you could say déjà vu, déjà lu, déjà su, already seen, already read, already known. The FRA identified about 350 AI policy initiatives. So alongside the ethical turn, there are also the turn in policy initiatives to implement regulations, to implement ethical principles. And the question we are left with is, does the Draft AI Act adequately deal with all of these ethical issues? And I think that's very much open to debate. Here's an example of something recent, the Council of Europe AI principles of 2020. And they mention, now we're not going to read these out, you can read them yourself, they're unexceptionable. Yeah, who would disagree? Yes, there's human dignity, in fact, mentioned as number one, prevention of harms. There is transparency, there is accountability and responsibility. There is democracy, which I think is not really much talked about in previous documents. And of course, the rule of law, human autonomy, or human agency, as one might say, and other human freedoms, gender equality, diversity. So the Council of Europe has picked up principles that go beyond the first turn to ethics. Now let's go back a little bit to the Draft AI Act, and just a few key points. I've quoted there from the explanatory memorandum, in which it talks about a balanced and proportionate regulatory approach limited to the minimum necessary requirements to address risks and problems without unduly constraining or hindering technological development, so or disproportionately increasing the cost of solutions on the market. So there already you find a kind of limitation to what it could be as an act regulating AI. They don't want to upset the economy. They don't want to upset innovation. They don't want to upset data-driven developments. They don't want to put disproportionate burdens on market participants. So that original thing in the explanatory memorandum already puts us on our guard to what the limits of regulating AI might be in terms of the Draft AI Act. They do mention many times fundamental rights, trustworthiness, freedom, transparency, and they do, as Christian pointed out, have a risk-based approach in which the heaviest regulation is for situations of high risk to fundamental rights, but also safety from the use of AI as part of products, considering the intended purpose of the products. And one can, I'll come back to this, I think, in a little bit. There are shortcomings in all of that. Yes, of course, there are prohibitions. In Article 5, I'm not going to read these out, but they have to do with subliminal techniques beyond a person's consciousness. Well, that's a very peculiar way of stating what this Article 5 is all about, but also putting limits on what it can do. And also the exploitation of the vulnerabilities of a specific group due to various characteristics, and the estimation of likely physical or psychological harm. So those are some of the prohibitions. There's some more. Prohibitions on public authority systems for classifying people in relationship to their social behavior. I'm not going to read out all of these words. And also under Article 5D, the use of real-time remote biometric identification systems in publicly accessible spaces for the purpose of law enforcement. So already it's really rather narrowly constrained are those prohibitions. Doesn't mention the private sector, in terms of classification of people, and it also doesn't mention non-real-time biometric identification systems. Those are just two of the criticisms one might make. Well, what have been the commentaries on the draft AI Act? As you may know, the consultation that was put out received some 304 submissions, plus there are many other academic and other commentaries on the draft AI Act. I've not read all 304 submissions, but I've read a fair proportion of them, and I find some of them very interesting and worth consideration, as we will see in a few minutes. Most of the commentaries, most of the consultation responses favored legal regulation in principle, but worried about the gaps and the uncertainties, the loopholes, and all of the rest. They challenge, some of the people challenge the risk basis on the grounds that it's ambiguous, that it's arbitrary, and that it ignores unintended consequences. I can come back to that a little bit. But also that the product safety model is seen by many critics as a very doubtful analogy, and very doubtful in terms of how you govern that, and how it will work out in practice. Because after all, AI is not like a toaster where you can talk about the safety of a product in fairly simple terms. So the analogy really isn't all that terrific, and why I don't know the inner stories about how the AI Act was drafted, but to lean on a product safety model seems like a step too easy to take in order to regulate AI. Also, some critics say that it's very formulaic, that while it might mention fundamental rights and other ethical norms and principles, that there is very little depth or conviction. It's the same boilerplate phrases being rolled out in recitals and clauses and so on. So it gives really little depth or conviction. That's what some of the commentaries do say. Here are some that I've picked out as being perhaps quite interesting. There's some commentaries on risk, on the risk-based approach, which has been given by the Information Accountability Foundation, which is a private sector, business-oriented group of people who have been increasingly talking about ethics in recent years. I'm not going to read these out again, but again, they criticize the relationship between the AI Act and the so-called conformity assessments that are specified, and they are criticizing the way conformity assessments might happen with regard to product safety, where you do have established standards, and you can see whether the product conforms to those standards. But with regard to AI, there are no established standards, and so why should a conformity assessment be thought to be a good approach for regulating AI? There are further commentaries on the question of harm. And this is from Mireille Hildebrandt, whom some of you may know, Professor Hildebrandt. She says that negative impacts are not limited to the level of individual harm. That what about the public sphere? What about democratic processes? What about the public goods, as I mentioned before, which are part and parcel of what we would like to have in the way of understanding and appreciating privacy and other human rights. There are also a very, very good article by Michael Veal and Frederick Zouteveen-Bohesius, who talk about in terms of harm, the loopholes in looking at manipulative AI systems, if they are unlikely to cause an individual harm, that there's a loophole there. They also point out about the emotional classification of people on emotional grounds, whereas further downstream in the way in which AI gets used, things become harmful rather than at the first step. So I would invite you to read their criticism about these points concerning harm, and likewise Mireille Hildebrandt's feedback to the commentaries given directly to the European Commission for the AI Act. There are also some commentaries about technology, about impact and about responsibility. A group called Algorithm Watch has said that the need to regulate a system shouldn't be triggered by what kind of technology it is, AI or machine learning or something, but should be triggered by the impact that it has on individuals and society, and that is insufficiently emphasized within the AI Act. There's also further feedback, interestingly, by Google. And Google says that if you talk about the provider of an AI system, that is to ignore the whole chain of things that go on beyond the initial provider, a whole class of deployers before you get to the ultimate end user. And the term user, by the way, as we all may appreciate, is a very, very ambiguous and unspecific term, because there are all kinds of intermediate users. And Google is saying a new class of deployers should be charged with responsibility for complying with the regulatory requirements. So that's another very interesting comment that's been made. And finally, there's some commentaries on the biometric identification. Here, once again, Mireille Hildebrandt has made some remarks there about the limitations of what is prohibited in the way of biometric identification systems and categorization and emotional recognition. And she emphasizes the importance of democracy and human dignity as part of this, which is missed out in a kind of product safety model of regulation. Let me turn now very, very briefly to look at the preamble to the UNESCO draft recommendation on the ethics of AI. Now, they have developed something fairly recently towards the end of 2021, draft recommendations on the ethics of artificial intelligence. And they are proposing a standard-setting instrument developed through a global approach based on international law, focusing on human dignity and human rights, as well as these other values of gender equality, social and economic justice, and environmental and ecosystem protection. And they look at AI technologies as raising some fundamental ethical concerns in terms of bias, in terms of threats to cultural diversity and social and economic divides, and in terms of the need for transparency and the understandability of algorithms and training data, because all of those may have a potential impact on human dignity, human rights, fundamental freedoms, and all the other things that we come to know and love, including animal welfare, environment, and the ecosystem. An interesting thing about the UNESCO draft recommendations is that the basis of it is not only based upon international, national, and national legal frameworks, but also as a way of connecting to ethical values, connecting ethical values and principles to the challenges and the opportunities linked to AI technology. The reason why they talk about values is that they say values play a powerful role as motivating ideals in shaping policy measures and legal norms. So they start at the value end in order to filter down into policy measures and legal norms. And they also talk about the values and principles being not only desirable per se, but however, in any practical context, they may be in tension with each other. And that is insufficiently recognized whenever you see a list of ethical principles or ethical values and so on. Relatively few people are talking about the tensions that might arise between those and how those create wicked problems for resolution. So here UNESCO is pointing that out, I think very interestingly. Well, what are the values and principles that they themselves are promoting?
I just wanted to let you know it's just a couple of minutes more to go.
Oh, I'm sorry. I will try and hurry up then.
Thanks.
Okay, I want to get to my third part, which is on safety and security. These are values. These are the list of principles. You will note that safety and security are there. And I want to pick up very shortly on safety and security. They also made recommendations for a whole range of policy actions and areas. And we in the Alan Turing Institute, some of us are trying to look to see how those policy actions and areas can be developed and looked at in terms of ethical guidance. But their principle of safety and security, what do we mean by safety and security? I've been puzzled by this for many, many years, that they're very rarely defined or defined satisfactorily. There's SEN, the Standards Organization, giving a wide definition. UNESCO gives a narrow definition more towards privacy and data. But they say safe and secure AI without distinguishing as to whether safety and security are two separate values or whether they're synonyms. And certainly in some languages, there's one word for both of them. Well, if we want to look more carefully at security and safety, we find there are many dimensions. There's physical safety, political, socioeconomic, cultural safety, national security, human security, information security. What do we mean when we talk about safety and security? Well, it has to be more specific than simply saying safety and security. Going a bit further on this, there's objective security, the feeling of being secure, but there's the subjective security, the feeling of being secure or insecure. There's also so-called objective security, which based upon the probabilities of risk and almost numerical risk analysis. Now, in conflicts, which of these forms of security or safety should prevail if there are conflicts, as I mentioned before, but also can you really measure security? And if so, how much security do we need? How much safety do we need? Is there a concept of good enough safety, good enough security, or must it be 100%? We are told that countries' number one priority is the safety and security of their citizens. Well, yes and no. How much do citizens need? How much do they want? How much is feasible to devise? Here's some definitions of security. I'm not going to go into this because time is limited, but we need to have a wider definition of security away from national security, let us say, to human security, which is people-centered. The UN Human Rights document of 1994 talks about people-centered security. In recent constructs, we have privacy and security being seen as opposites. You can have privacy or you can have security. There's a quotation from Amitai Etzioni, who's a communitarian theorist. And he says that individualism is against communitarianism because individualism is the realm of rights, private choice, self-interest versus the common good. Well, his word versus ignores an awful lot, and I would take issue with Etzioni on this. Here's the Intelligence and Security Committee of the UK Parliament, which also makes the same kind of framing. They talk about, they say, in addition to considering whether the statutory framework governing access to private communications is adequate, the committee is considering the appropriate balance between our individual right to privacy and the collective right to security. And there are four difficulties with that. One is the definition of privacy and security. The others are the framing of it and what they mean by appropriate balance. I won't go into this one in too much detail, but again, How much privacy do we need? Whose privacy are we talking about? What's the social distribution of privacy? What's the social distribution of security? And shouldn't we pay attention to that in assessing the harms that something like AI can bring about? I would contend that privacy and security, or privacy and safety, have close affinities. Privacy itself is a security or a safety value. And there are a number of reasons that I've given there. I've written a paper or two on this if you want to see a further development of this. So in this sense, privacy and security of the society or of the state is really two takes on the public interest. It's not the individual versus society, whom should we favor, but rather which kind of public interest value should we favor? The public interest in privacy or the public interest in safety, if in fact there is a conflict between the two, and there needn't necessarily be. The Americans have got this a bit better. This is an American document under the Obama administration, where they say in American tradition, security has multiple meanings, and they get the point that it refers not only to national security, but also the right of people to be secure in their persons, houses, and papers, which is on the basis of which you have an awful lot of privacy legislation being developed. So the Americans understand the idea that privacy and security are not opposites, but that they go together. What do we mean by balance? Again, this is something I've been worrying away about for a long time, and I've written a fair amount on it if you want to have a look at it, but so have many other writers, and I've listed some sources there, including Hildebrandt and others. And the idea of balancing, while it has an element of truth, is also very misleading. So to conclude, 2 slides, if I'm allowed 1 minute, half a minute each. I think there's unfinished business in governing AI. We need to have more clarity on crucial things like risk, harm, safety, or security. What levels are we talking about of each? What social distribution, and so on. Clarity on what to regulate. Should we regulate technology or technological research or use or whatever? We need to have clarity on what is meant by accountability and responsibility and transparency. On whom should those values, should those requirements fall? We need clarity on ethics and redress of breaches of ethics, and we need clarity on the governance and the oversight and the regulation. Who is to regulate, what should be regulated, and where on the planet should that be regulated? And there are some unanswered questions in governing AI. Can ethical assumptions and practical proposals really be global and multicultural, or are they too Western-oriented and based upon Western values? The project that I'm working on in the Alan Turing Institute is looking at the UK and Japan in terms of human-computer, human-machine interaction, and looking at the values that underpin them in very different cultures. Also, will today's ethics be tomorrow's ethics? What is the stability of any list of ethical principles in the face of what we might be looking at tomorrow or the next day or the next century? And what are the limitations of law and technical design in regulating AI? What combination of regulatory instruments do we need, given that we don't only need law, but we need to have ethical principles to back it up and accompany it? And we also need some technological means, like things like data protection by default and by design. And how well are practitioners of AI trained to understand the social impacts of what they are doing? To what extent are they trained in their education, in their computer science degrees, in their early career work for companies? Do they get the point, and are they trained to get the point about social impacts? So I think that's where I am. I'm very sorry for taking a little bit of time, so I think we may only have time for a single espresso rather than a double espresso in the coffee break. But thank you very much.
Very much, Charles.
Okay.
Is there someone with a question in the room? We just have 5 minutes for questions if somebody wants to. A question from someone watching our live stream. You may have already answered in your presentation. It was one of the open questions on the last slides. He or she is asking whether ethics are universal enough to be used globally, or at least supranationally, or aren't they too dependent on local societies and cultures?
Well, I think this is something that needs to be researched and needs to be determined, because sometimes we can stereotype cultures as being sui generis. Sometimes we can say, here's the East and here's the West, and the Japanese or the Chinese or the Koreans are very different in the way they think about ethics from the way we in the West do. But if you look at the way we in the West, whoever we in the West are, there's all kinds of variations on these ethics and the contexts in which ethical norms, values, or principles might arise. And likewise, within societies in the so-called East, you not only have contextual and cultural differences within those blocks of cultures or countries, but also the context in which they arise. It isn't as though, I mean, for a long time people said, oh, the Japanese have no word for privacy. Okay, they don't have a word for privacy perhaps, but they certainly have a concept of what it means to be private and in what context privacy is a desirable thing for people to have. It may be a different set of desirabilities from the ones that people elsewhere in the world might have, and vice versa. But it doesn't mean that those values are strictly culture bound and therefore not translatable or not communicable to other societies and cultures. But we're just beginning to scratch the surface on that. What is the meaning of the self in Western societies, plural? What's the meaning of the self in non-Western societies? What is the value of communal protection in an African society compared to communal protection within a Western or an Eastern society? I'm being very, very general in this because the research, the research-based answers are still being looked for and are still being found and investigated. So, but I think it's a very valid question to ask about whether we are so culture bound that any attempt to have a global, 193 country ethical system might be regarded at the moment as a bit too ambitious.
Okay, thanks. Yes, I would suggest we conclude this session now. We have 20 minutes for our coffee break. Maybe the people watching from our live stream also take the chance to take a coffee instead of answering some emails. We will follow up at 4 o'clock with our panel discussion, and you're welcome to join us again on the live stream. And as I said before, there will be enough time to post some questions into the Q&A section of the live stream. Thank you.
Well, welcome back from the coffee break. Hope you enjoyed the espresso at home as well. Now, in the panel discussion, we have the opportunity to expand and deepen these different perspectives with 3 more. To that end, I'm especially pleased to introduce first our panel discussion participants. These are first Lorena Jompalazzi. Hello, Lorena. Lorena is founder of the Ethical Tech Society, a non-profit organization researching processes of automation and digitization with regards to their social relevance. She researches the ethics of digitization and automatization. In this context, she also deals with questions of legal philosophy. In 2017, she was appointed by the Spanish government to the high-level expert group on artificial intelligence and data policy. And she's one of the 100 experts of the COTEC Foundation for her work on automation and ethics. She's as well member of the advisory board on education and discourse of the Goethe Institute. Lorena has testified before the European Parliament and the European Commission on Artificial Intelligence and Ethics on several occasions. And she additionally heads the Secretariat of the German National Section of the IGF, as well as projects on internet governance in Asia and Africa. She has co-authored and edited various publications, and in 2018 she was awarded the Theodor Heuss Medal for her contribution to the differentiated view on algorithms and their mechanisms for the Algorithm Watch initiative. Lorena, welcome, and we are very much looking forward to your impact. This is one of the online participants. We have one here in Vienna. This is David Reiche. He is physically present. He is a member of the Research and Data Unit of the European Union Agency for Fundamental Rights, the FRA, and his area of expertise includes statistical data analysis, data quality, and statistical data visualization. He has extensive experience in working with data and statistics in international contexts. Prior to joining FRA in 2014, he worked for the research department of the International Center for Migration Policy Development and as a lecturer at the Institute for Sociology and the Institute of International Development at the University of Vienna. He holds a PhD in sociology and has published numerous articles, working papers, and book chapters on issues related to migration and integration, migration statistics, citizenship, and irregular migration. Welcome, David, and thank you for being here. And last but not least, as well, physically present is Johann Jass. He is a senior researcher at the ITA team and the work package leader in the PANELFIT project for the security and cybersecurity issues. Johann is an economist with a technical background. His research is focusing on ICT and their impact. Before joining the ITA, he worked as a technical consultant in industrial automation projects. So he has been a researcher at ITA since 1988, quite the same time as me. We are so one of the first being here at this institute, and he is very interested in regulatory issues of new ICT and privacy, and of course in artificial intelligence. He coordinated the EU-projects Prize and Surprise on surveillance and security technologies with a focus on societal consequences and conformity with fundamental rights. He is also active as a consultant and evaluator on ethics issues for research projects for the European Commission. And as might have some of you seen on the draft program, we also have invited the representative from the Federal Ministry of the Interior. Unfortunately, his participation had to be cancelled due to the pandemic. We wish you all the best for a speedy recovery from here. So after this short introduction, I would like, with Lorena, and giving her the chance to have a first statement. And Lorena, you have monitored and helped shaping the development of AI technology as well as the regulation. How satisfied are you with the current draft AI Act?
Thank you for the invitation and for having me here, at least online. Greetings from Brandenburg, nearby from Berlin. I think that we are at the very beginning of a long transformation process. And with this, there's a saying in Spanish, when you are expecting pears from an oak tree, and I'm not expecting pears or apples from an oak tree. I know that an oak tree cannot give that much. So I think that we have to be realistic with what we can achieve. But of course, looking at the everyday issues, and the way how technologies function in reality and the conflicts that that I find when I look at those technologies, or when I'm trying to create a technology myself with any type of complex or less complex algorithmic formulas and so on. It is important to acknowledge that that many of the problems that we have not that much to do with algorithms specifically, but with something prior to that, which is the way how we think about science, and which has a lot to do with how we systematize the world, both from a normative perspective, from an academic perspective, from a scientific perspective. To put it very blunt and short, I'm not satisfied at all, because I think that the problems that we have with many of the algorithmic systems that we are discussing are epistemological problems, are problems of how we, in our culture, in our society, have been thinking about how to observe things and how to categorize things and how to do science. So many of those problems are not necessarily unique to algorithmic issues, but are also problems that we find when we do law and create law and think about law, and are also finding in many other disciplines. And I'm going to try to be a bit more concrete. One of the things, or there are a few elements that have characterized the way how we create science and do observations. And that thinking has been coined by specific people, and by specific ideas. The idea of rationality, and thinking that you can have objective observations that are detached from the position of the person that is observing things, and assuming that independent of your societal position, of your cultural position, of your gender identity, and the language that you speak, you can do purely objective observation. And that's one of the elements of that thinking that leave us to the idea, to the problematic idea to think that there is that positions do never influence the way how we look at the world, and that goes farther on with ideas like we can outsource our rationality, this idea of rationality, to machines, which is something that we see with projects like the calculus machine from Leibniz. Leibniz was starting this sort of, as Justin Smith says, this century-old project of outsourcing rationality to machines, thinking that this idea can be a form of, and that's the third element, a form of optimizing nature. In this case, human nature, human rationality. Because the perception of nature is very much coined by a Christian, but also by the Enlightenment idea of nature as a hierarchical idea where humans are at the top of it and have the privilege, but also the obligation to use their rationality to make use of it and even perfectionate it. So this leads to very different elements in the way how we do science that are problematic. Things like that we first have a form of what I call the mechanical thinking, where we try to solve problems by first making modules of those problems, and thinking that once you've structured the problem that you want to solve in several modules, and you resolve module by module, at the very end you have resolved the whole problem, which in societal context is like equal to thinking that you can explain the woods by explaining every single tree. And there's a part of it that gets missed. There's another element that also characterizes how we approach this scientific approach. I'm talking like, I'm trying to be very, this is like a very raw approach to it. There's a lot of specification and a lot of other scientific approaches that have been criticizing and discussing this, but this is something that has marked both our legal conversations and also our engineers' conversations, but also conversation in social sciences to a certain extent. The other idea, based on that idea of rationality, is that based on the belief that you can make rational observations, you can identify the essence of things, the things that remain observable at a universal level and remain stable, so to say, a very Cartesian thinking. And this implies trying to essentialize through categorizations that always brings problems, specifically both in legal and also in algorithmic thinking. Why? Because when you try to capture the essence of human beings or of social things, of social contexts, you are always going to qua natura, you are always going to create bias, because human and social ambivalence is impossible to categorize and put in small drawers. Every categorization is a restriction, a distortion of what that ambivalence and what those dynamics, those social dynamics and those social contexts mean. So these essentialist approaches that have this universal connotation, because you don't create categories if you don't have a objective of categorizing for the sake of generalization, become problematic in algorithmic situations. But of course, that's not the only place where they become problematic. And we've seen that also in law, when we create categories that we suddenly realize are not inclusive for many people, as we've seen in debates about transsexual people wanting to be acknowledged as such, or in different models of marriage and the recognition of different ways of having families, and that are also operationalized in law through categories. So what I see here is that we are replicating a very old thinking, centuries old thinking. And this is not only being replicated in algorithmic systems, but the way how we are addressing it through law is sort of creating a dynamic where we are precisely provoking through law that algorithmic thinking keeps being essentialistic and anthropocentristic, and with that creating those tensions and those problems with regards to bias and discrimination that we're seeing now. And I'll leave it there.
Okay, thank you very much for this first input. Very interesting things about the old thinking, and what to do with old thinking and modern technologies is more or less the key question. May I ask you, David, in the report, Getting the Future Right, Artificial Intelligence and Fundamental Rights, based on empirical research on AI applications, the private and public sectors, a number of requirements were set out for AI systems from there. Are these adequately addressed in the AI Act, or what could you tell us about that?
Sure. First of all, let me thank you and the organizers for inviting me to this great panel discussion. It's a real pleasure being on this panel. And hope next time I can meet also Lorena and Charles in person again. So I work at the EU Agency for Fundamental Rights as a project manager, managing the projects on artificial intelligence and now also on online content moderation. As I realized my CV was a bit outdated. So that's why I'm what we're mainly dealing with now. And at FRA, we started around 2017, addressing the topic of new technologies, big data and AI, and how this impacts fundamental rights. So we've published several reports so far dealing with discrimination, data quality and artificial intelligence, face recognition technology, and the latest report is that you mentioned on Getting the Future Right, where we had a horizontal analysis of fundamental rights implications when using AI, based on interviews with those who are actually using some sort of AI in the EU, which is much needed because a lot of discussions around AI are really abstract and not very useful, I would say. So before answering the question, let me just highlight a few fundamental rights issues that are relevant to consider. On a horizontal way, we heard a lot already in the great keynote from Professor Wenderhorst on data protection. That's obviously at the core of AI discussions. When we interviewed people, the good thing also about GDPR and that it's so famous is that most people are fully aware of data protection issues. So people developing AI, they know, oops, there is something I really need to think about. And that's what we found in the field. On the other side, also a bit reflecting what we heard earlier this afternoon, it's not always entirely clear how the provisions in the GDPR would apply to the use of AI. And there are also questions linked to what is personal data and when is it anonymized data, which is not always clear, and also how to apply some of the provisions in the GDPR, those linked to automated decision-making, what is explanation or right to meaningful information. However, it's still one of the core rights that needs to be addressed when using AI. The second one, and that needs more attention, is non-discrimination. Obviously, when you automate something based on data, it can put people at a disadvantage based on one of the protected characteristics as outlined in Article 21 of the Charter of Fundamental Rights, such as ethnic origin, gender, language, or sexual orientation. Most people know that something like discrimination can happen, but don't really know how you should look into this and how this can happen. So there's clearly more need for in-depth analysis of certain applications of AI to the extent as they can discriminate against people based on protected characteristics. And then the third area we highlighted in our report, linked to the area of access to justice, is access to an effective remedy, meaning that people always, when there are decisions being made about people, they have the right to complain about these decisions. For this, you need to know that somehow, somewhere, some new AI technology was used. Secondly, you also need to know where and how to complain about this. And lastly, and that's the crucial part, which also comes up in data protection discussions, but I think it's really relevant for effective remedies, is that those using AI need to be ready to explain actually how they arrived at certain decisions. And this, I know, is a very contested field, because many people say, oh, AI is very complicated, we actually don't know how this happens, and so we can't explain decisions. And this is, of course, especially in public administration, not acceptable. I also think it's a bit overstated, because it's not that difficult to explain decisions once you start clearly explaining what you did. And this leads also to the recommendation that before using AI, a so-called fundamental rights impact assessment should be carried out, meaning you start with basic information on what is the purpose of an AI tool, what are the data they are based on, how they were developed, what is the goal that we're optimizing for, what tests have been done in order to assure that it's fair, for example, and so forth. And this is very much needed because fundamental rights implications and risks only occur in a certain context. And while we highlight these three rights, of course, fundamental rights implications go much wider, and virtually all fundamental rights can be impacted by the use of AI, depending on what area it's used. And the advantage AI is a very general technology that can be used in all areas of life. On the regulation of AI, first, a quick reflection on what we also heard in the second keynote this afternoon. I think it's of crucial importance to start all the discussions around the regulation based on human rights, on fundamental rights, to have a rights-based approach. This is not going against an ethics approach, of course, because ethics and fundamental rights are very similar. The reason for that is that it's much more instrumental. I mean, fundamental rights were developed after very bad lessons, especially we learned in Europe, and they are a commonly democratically established agreed set of standards. And this is why we have to start with this when regulating new technologies, as they apply to new technologies as well. If they're not sufficient, then we have to discuss it and see what else is needed. And the other advantage, of course, of a rights-based approach is that it's legally binding, because we have often seen, especially large companies, advocating very much for an ethics approach, which, of course, is also linked to the fact that regulation should be avoided. Then, second point, and I have 3 points on the regulation, AI, as we know and heard already today, is not unregulated. Apart from the partly direct applicability of human rights and fundamental rights, we have the GDPR. The GDPR is a great law. I think it's really important to embrace the GDPR. It's at the moment not the only, but the most advanced laws that has provisions in there that helps us addressing fundamental rights issues when using new technologies. But as I said, as we heard, many aspects are not entirely clear, and it would take quite a while to wait for the courts to decide on how to interpret certain provisions. And that's also why there was need for further action. Also, let me mention there's EU non-discrimination law, which of course also equally applies when new technologies are used for making decisions or any decisions that impact on people. So the AI Act was clearly needed because there are more problems that came up. So the AI Act is a very welcome initiative, and it's of course, it will help to increase the transparency of use of AI. And the lack of transparency is, in my view, one of the most challenging problems to new technologies. And that's partly not only linked because it's difficult to describe new technologies, but partly simply because they aren't. And this is what the law should support. It is, at the Fundamental Rights Agency, we have no official position now on the AI Act, so I can only speak to a few selected aspects based on my own opinion or own analysis. And what I would like to highlight as a positive on the AI Act is linking it to what FRA wants in terms of fundamental rights impact assessment and transparency, that the documentation requirements are quite good. Of course, we can discuss many of these aspects in there, but requiring those using AI to describe the training data, for example, to describe the assessments they made in terms of different groups are really useful and will actually really help to increase the protection of fundamental rights. However, I'm aware that there are many detailed discussions around the AI Act, and it's really important to take this discussion seriously. To end this opening statement, aware of the time, let me just highlight one aspect, and that I haven't heard today, and so I think it's really important, is actually what do we mean by artificial intelligence? We got used to discussing it without agreeing on what we're actually talking about. And when it comes to making a law, and in terms of legal certainty for those applying the law, it's really important that we know what it is about. FRA recommended that there should be a careful definition of AI. In the AI Act, I think there is a careful definition. It's a generic definition, but the question is if it's clear to everyone. We heard about the high-risk use case approach, so I think it's really important in the discussions around the AI Act to make sure that people know what these high-risk use cases cover and what they don't. In our research, we found that people have really different imaginations of what AI is. Some people think it's only selected aspects of deep learning, and others think, no, it starts with a simple statistics already. Others have no problem talking about basic rule-based algorithms on AI, and so forth. And yeah, that's all good and fine, but it should be clear. And I think all the discussions around the definition should really not lead to narrowing down the scope of protection as we currently would understand it. I'll stop here, as I've spoken too long for an opening statement, but yeah, look forward to the discussion.
If you have to prioritize, if you have to think of the most important things right now, knowing about the political and the technological situation out there, who and when should be the next thing to be done, and what are the most important things? What could be a step forward, not to mention a solution because of the many open questions and businesses?
Well, I knew that I was letting myself into trouble when I listed unfinished business, and it was going to come back and bite me in the foot. But thank you, Walter, for biting me in the foot on this. I don't know, and it's a question of in what arena these different unfinished pieces of business or these unanswered questions should be tackled or addressed. I think that. And here I'm not talking so much about legislation, and I take Christian's point very well about the crowded policy space, and you get too many acts crowding in on each other, each going through maybe overlapping but sort of separate policy processes. You may end up with a mess at the end, and that's no good for anybody. So I'm not talking about yet another piece of legislation, but I'm talking about some kind of serious attempt in some forum or other, or plural fora or other, to tackle some of the main underpinning conceptual issues and dilemmas. And the ones that I keep coming back to, and maybe it's because I have been thinking about them for quite some time without making terribly much progress myself, have to do with clarification of some of the key concepts, such as harm, such as the question of balancing one right with another, or one claim with another. Clarification, thinking about, deeply thinking about what we really do mean by safety and security. These are often not defined at all, and in my presentation, I said, well, there are all kinds of different adjectival securities and safeties: personal safety, national security, public safety, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And while, of course, these may be contextualized variations of the same theme, one wonders whether they would be amenable to more precise analyses about why, first of all, why safety and security have become such overarching headline principles or items. To what fears do safety and security policies respond? And why do we have these kinds of fears? Who has the fears that they need to have more security or more safety? And what are the consequences of enhancing safety and security, whatever they might mean, the consequences for other opportunities to enhance life or to enhance rights and so on? And to give you an example, maybe a very kind of simplified example, but let's look at children's play and playgrounds. There has been a big move towards safety consciousness in children's playgrounds. Okay, I'm just taking that as an illustration. It's not a kind of prototype for talking about the safety of technologies. But it has been deemed that children should not harm themselves, largely because the liability for that would fall on the local authority that had the playground and they didn't provide enough safety equipment and so on. But what are the consequences for children's development if you reduce their exposure to safety so that they don't learn what are the dangers and how they can protect themselves, and therefore they think that they're in a totally dangerous world, and therefore the pressures for having yet more and more safety or security are piled on without anybody ever really examining what they mean Why is it important? When is it important? When is it not important? Who runs the risks? And is there an equitable distribution of the risks and the harms? Never mind what level of risks and harms. Now, I think that we need to have some deep thinking about that, and partly it's academic thinking, and partly it's creative thinking by people who are not necessarily academically based, but who are practitioners in one or another field of life in which issues of harm, issues of risk, issues of safety are thought about and addressed, rather than simply reaching for ready-made solutions. We must put helmets on everybody in order to so that they don't bang their heads. So that may sound trivial, and it may sound really off the wall, and not really part of a discussion about AI regulation. But I think that we need to have some thinking about those very terms and those very concepts that are used as the underpinnings of that kind of legislation. So that's one area which I think needs to be clarified, and the other being what happens when you have a conflict of values and principles with each other, a conflict of rights with each other, and that may be worked out in political arenas, in democratic political arenas, in which people can be represented or have their say or discuss those sorts of issues, maybe at a very local community level, but maybe at a national or international level, and how we go about finding ways of accommodating the different claims on behalf of different principles. And that's why I took exception to Etzioni's idea, or about the UK Parliament's idea about collective security and individual privacy, which in my mind are not opposites anyway. But we need to have more thought about those and more debate and deliberation about those. So that is how that's my first take on how I would do that. I have other answers about one or two of the other points, but I'll leave that for now.
Okay, thank you very much. And now I would like to hand over to Johan. After years dealing with the issue at stake, we heard there is a fairness, there is transparency, there is human-centered technical development around. Are we on the right track to address with the current approaches the regulatory efforts? Is there any way a chance to have trustworthy AI in the end? What could you say about that?
Difficult question, but let's say in general, I think we are on the right way as it is urgent. We are in urgent times, so urgent need of moving on from guidelines, to more binding, more regulation that can be used and that can be enforced. Just taking the term of trustworthy AI, I don't think that this is one of the examples where I don't agree that this way could be direct us in the right direction. So why? So first of all, AI itself is something problematic. We should put it into quotes, and it is also not addressed or not solved by the AI Act, but possibly this is also not possible because it's a bundle of different technologies, and for this purpose, AI might serve perfectly, not perfectly, but might be useful. When we come to the term trustworthy AI, I really think we should not come comfortable with this term. And this term was only created in the recent years, and I think it is an output of the high-level expert group. And why? Why should we, let's say, why should we be skeptical about technologies which are intelligent and trustworthy? And why should we? Because neither is true. So I think we could, and both intelligent and trustworthiness have very positive connotations. But if we are label a kind of technology in this way, then we are allocating them more autonomy, more power, more, let's say, we are less skeptical than it might be necessary. And just in general, I think it would be quite absurd to speak about a trustworthy car, a trustworthy computer, or a trustworthy machine in general. So I think it's something tricky that also changes our perception of this kind of technology. A second critical point related to the AI Act is that I'm more critical about the risk-based approach. Not that much in general, so, but maybe more the way it is undertaken. Of course, it makes sense to distinguish between AI applications uses for scientific research, for production processes, and AI uses which affect or assess or influence decisions on humans. And for this kind of applications, I would go for all, would not have any green one or yellow one, but maybe all have on the higher level. Like the GDPR, you have the personal data and then you have exceptions. And with this approach, I think it's more that you are sorting out some examples where it's forbidden, where we have strict regulation, and then you have, for the rest, it's more or less free. And maybe it's, I should explain it also a bit more. Maybe it has also to do with one of my personal experiences. As Walter said, I'm working for almost 15 years as ethics evaluator for the Commission and for the Research Executive Agency. And they have completely changed the structure from, according to modern approaches, from a rule-based or criteria-based approach of ethics evaluation to a risk-based ethics evaluation, which is making it more or less useless. So we have only a very, very few examples. If you're working with primates, if you want to change the genetic heritage, then it's clear. But for all other, it's almost difficult, impossible, not impossible, but you would have to do really to plan something very, very bad, that it comes to be a high-risk research. And it's not clear, but this should not happen for the AI Act or for AI technologies. Because maybe many of you have suffered from the recommendations, requirements imposed to projects. But what I can see now that we have a number of projects which could benefit from, which are not bad, which have no big problems, but they could benefit quite a lot of getting some kind of advice, but this is missing now. We don't have this kind of, I'm not sure where the borderline will be at the end with the AI Act. And okay. Yes, one more point would be the requirement to impose or to have human oversight. I think it's really critical, but I think we should also make sure that this is also workable, that it is possible. So, because in many cases, AI technologies are used to analyze huge amounts of data very quickly, and no human being can do it in the same time. So it's, if we ask persons how can we realistically decide on decisions or reject decisions that are made by the systems. So it maybe at least for critical, which could have critical impacts on human beings, we should right from the beginning on exclude the use of AI technologies for these purposes. And the last point is I'm also skeptical about the concept of ethics by design. On the one hand, I fully agree that we should try to design technologies in a way that they can respect fundamental rights, that they can be used in an ethical way, but this can only be necessary and by no means a sufficient condition. And also, as raised been earlier, so I think ethical judgments on complex issues require human deliberation. They can neither be replaced by checklists nor made by AI systems. And if we see what has happened with the decades-long development of privacy-hazard technologies or privacy by design, they are hardly used. And if they are not enforced by law, they are not effective at all. Okay. And maybe just only coming back also to the last number of instruments. This was also included in one of my initial questions. I think we should be more cautious to always to start when we have a new technology, a new application, and start to think about new regulations, new rules. So, but first, see what can be happened, because it's then a kind of excuse not to do nothing until we have a new regulation. And this, okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Johan. That was quite a lot for the first round. Thanks. I would like to give the opportunity to all the panelists to have questions on their partners on the panel. If so, first of all, Lorena, do you have any questions or further comments?
I'd rather say I have comments. I think in the very end, what we are regulating is sort of a distraction. And in the very end, what we are discussing is about the future of regulation. How do we want to regulate in the future? Is it in the normal convention where we used to regulate based on context? Because, of course, the European Union law culture comes from a very specific origin. And we have different law cultures around the world, and the European Union is based on a mainly and mostly Roman German law culture, and that brings a specific methodological approach with it. And we used to regulate based on context, so the technology was on a second level relevant, but it was not on the first level the point of, so to say, of entry to start regulating. So when we start, when we decide that now we want to regulate things like technology in such an horizontal way, this has a massive impact for the way how we've been regulating before and for the laws that were in place before. And this has not started with the AI Act, it has already started with data protection. And I think that we need to be aware that those different approaches to regulation, whether I want to approach regulating the workplace, or I want to regulate discrimination, or I want to regulate how to coordinate infrastructure, that is a starting point that is quite different to the approach of I want to regulate a whole technology for all sectors. And with this, I think this is the important thing to really discuss. It's a meta-level discussion, but I think we are coming to a point where laws are conflicting more and more, and where we need to realize whether what we think that we are regulating is really what we want to regulate. I mean, this discussion we've been having with every time we had new technology. So when we had cars, it took a while until the until regulation around car making and the infrastructures around mobility were adapted accordingly. And at the very beginning, we had very weird, very funny regulation. We had the majors of towns that had to walk in front of the car with two red flags to make sure that, because we didn't have street lights and we didn't have any type of regulation around the streets. And without sort of breaking the point of having a car. Now, I think that when we look at artificial intelligence, what we're trying to regulate actually, and you can have a sense of it with this risk-based approach, is that we are trying to regulate the impact of that technology. Now, if we concentrate purely on this isolated view on technology, we might be missing the point. Now, we can see that, for instance, with the whole idea of credit scoring, where we've been having, and right now the ECJ has 2 cases, pending cases, to look at credit scoring, and it's all about making the algorithm transparent. And the question is the whole time around how good is the algorithm, how accurate is the algorithm, and how fair are the criteria put into the algorithm. With that, and taking this as a proxy for the credit policy of a bank. But that's a different story, because a bank might decide that they want to speculate with real estate, and if they want to speculate with real estate, they will give someone that have a very accurate score, but a low one, they might give that person the credit because they want to have quick access and easy access to real estate. So looking in that case to the algorithm wouldn't say anything about that malpractice. And this form of isolated picture or isolated view on technology, thinking that we only need to see how people are using it and so on, it sort of assumes that systems are operated in a vacuum, which they aren't. They are usually connected to 3 to 4 to 6 other systems, all of them with different logics, all of them with middleware so that they can all interoperate and work with each other, that also have their own logics. And then there's, of course, the human interaction there that keeps evolving so that you have a different situation every now and then, because society evolves and the usage of those technologies evolve as well. So thinking that the quality of a product is a proxy for to understand the problems at a societal level is very much the normative side of the technical solutionism that we are trying to criticize with this type of regulation. It's just the other side of the coin, thinking that if we solve the quality problems of the technology, we're going to solve the social impact and the risk of that technology when it's being created and implemented. So in the very end, I think that we are at a point right now where we have more and more technology of this kind, and where we also already have a lot of social sciences and specific groups of experts that have been telling us what the problems of how we systematize the world are. Because in the very end, AI is the child of the Enlightenment. It's the child of European thinking and of humanism. The very problems that we have are the very problems that we find in other disciplines. And what I think is what we need before we start doing laws is to think a bit about laws and to think about the norms that we are trying to create at those levels. Because AI is actually bringing the main friction of democracies to its peak, so to say. Because through that approach of trying to systematize societies, in the way how we do that I tried to describe before, a very succinct way, what we are making clear is the limits of democracy. One of the criticisms of Philippa Foot with the trolley dilemma was not about, oh, we have a dilemma because we don't know who should we kill, who should the operator kill? The 3 people in the one road of the rail, or the other 2 other people at the other road? You might remember that dilemma was used a lot as a metaphor for autonomous cars. And the point that she was trying to make is not that this is a dilemma, but that our democracies are methodologically individualistic. So we are only able to think of whose human rights do we have to trade against the other. So who should be killed? the one that is healthy, or the one that is older, or the one that has been that is a criminal, and so on. And from that perspective, of course, this is a dilemma. But if we make a step back and we do precisely what democracies have as an open housework, as many constitutional lawyers have been addressing for the past 30 years, it's the infrastructural view. If we think about the whole situation as an infrastructure, the question turns less of who should we kill, but more about a question of how should we create infrastructure to avoid a situation like this? How can we change the rails? And this is a question that there are examples out there when you see, for instance, how the underground in specific countries are prevented from people that commit suicide and throwing themselves to the rails, because you have glass walls that do not let you jump into the rails. Whereas in other societies, we think about liability. So there are different approaches to these type of so-called dilemmas. And the thing is, the interesting thing about AI that we seem to not want to recognize is that it's a form of infrastructure. It escalates like infrastructure. It is not about personal understanding individuals. It is about understanding generic individuals. It is not about, it's a form of mathematical formulation to have an overview over groups, over societal groups, over groups of something. Could be animals, could be a whole geography. But it's not about understanding the particularities of each individual. And it's also something that implies dependency. So it has all the qualities that infrastructures have. And infrastructures cannot be regulated through individual rights. And this we know in the European Union because we have, regarding infrastructure cooperation, we have created laws and principles in the 70s, in the 80s, and the 90s that have been stalled and we have not revisited. And through this approach of individual rights, what we're trying to a certain extent is to regulate a technology that looks at the woods by trying to regulate its tree. So there's a whole open gap there about societal values that of course crystallize and formulate and do have an impact at an individual level, but that still, dealing with the individual level problems, do not solve the societal values that are more than the sum of individual values. And I'm talking about things like social cohesion, plurality, like culture, like environment. Those are issues that have been identified by the European Union regarding infrastructural regulation as societal values. And we don't seem to want to address, but without us addressing them, this technology is all about precisely addressing that level. So this is why I think that we need to do sort of step back in the same way as we did in the 1920s when we were trying to regulate the cars, and rethink what we've been regulating once again to make sure that we're not running in front of an AI with 2 red flags and missing the point of the technology and its impact.
Okay. Thank you, Lorena, for this inspiring talk on the totally different, so to say, approach. Are there any comments from the panel? Daniel, please.
Thank you. No, very inspiring. I would say I mostly agree with you, Lorena. I'm different because I have a rather positive approach to the use of new technologies in general. I mean, first of all, is the question still, of course, I understand, but what we're trying to regulate. I mean, if people have malicious practices of some sort of thing, they can do this without and with AI. Of course, with AI, it can be upscaled, it can be more opaque, so we have a lot of problems there. I think the question is, and I also understand it's a tradition in governing society. I mean, statistics came up when nation states were created, societies are further developing, and now technologies are increasing, and that's, of course, also tools of governance. I still think technologies are very useful for society. The question is only we have to ask ourselves what we want and what we can automate. AI only works predictions when there are certain rules in society. And if we look into actually how the technology would start predicting something, it helps us understanding where there are certain structures in society and especially those which we don't want to. And I always think that statistics and now with machine learning parts, when you start understanding the biases in there, then you actually learn a big deal around society and around things that we don't want to. And at least also showing this to others who haven't understood that so far. And this way, I think, before understanding also what we automate, I just would like to point to the FRA paper on data quality and AI, which I think, wasn't picked up that much in the discussions as other of our outputs, where we speak about errors in representation in training data and errors of measurement in training data. And I think the errors of measurement is really something that is relevant, linked to the point of what is it that we are measuring, and is this something we can measure actually, and what are we doing when we measure something? And that speaks to what you were saying, of course, once you start measuring something, you're also reproducing societies. And this has an impact, and also when you use algorithms for automated decision making, then you base decisions on these algorithms, and this is then the data for the future development. I still think it's really important to look into these technologies and understanding where the problems come from. Then a second point, linked to some of Charles' comments, on the balancing of rights, and especially in relation to security. I think this is a very important and difficult area. As we all know, based on fundamental rights can be limited to some extent, if needed. And in law, there's actually a quite clear structure or rules laid out how to do that. You can limit some certain fundamental rights if it's necessary for societal goals and if it's proportionate. To give two examples. We looked at this, for example, in the area of facial recognition technology, which is a lot discussed in the area of law enforcement at the moment. And then there are discussions like how accurate are the predictions that you find a certain person, and how many errors do you make that you mistakenly flag some persons on the street. And these are the discussions that for all the use of AI actually need to be laid out in order to understand how strongly you infringe on persons' rights, and how, and if this is a trade-off on the limitation on privacy, which rarely will be the case. However, I also think the balancing of right is not that tricky, because it's usually quite obvious on when you're only transparent about what you're knowing on the technology. And this also, I think the difficult discussions are because there are no transparent descriptions of what the tools are doing. Another trade-off discussion is, for example, the collection of data on protected characteristics in order to learn about discrimination, which also goes against data protection laws. And then the last point maybe to add, because I heard also the question of automated decision-making and human oversight. I think this is another important area that is something we have to learn more about, because people may put too much trust into predictions from algorithms. And we know a case, for example, in Poland, where an employment service used algorithms, and I think virtually no of the decisions or recommendations coming from an algorithm were challenged or contested, meaning that human oversight may also not be necessary in several cases. So there are many, many aspects where we still have to learn. The technology is new. I think we also have to admit that it's a difficult area. But a precautious approach really helps us on several aspects not to learn it the hard way, but to prevent several damages from the outset.
Okay, thank you for this. Children's playground example by Charles. The colleague means, I'm afraid that the example of the children's playground doesn't really fit to the challenges and risks of AI. It's right that the strong safety regulations of playgrounds are hindering children's learning, but through the complexity and intransparency of AI, learning isn't immediately possible at all, as it could be at the playground. So the risk seems to be very different. So that is one thing which puts transparency again into the focus, I see. Charles, any comments on that? You're muted. Sorry, you're muted.
I wasn't meaning that you can, as an analogy, that you can transfer it from the playground to the, what would be a good metaphor, the sandbox of innovation. We hear a lot about sandboxes. Certainly, I think that's quite right. I only use it as an illustration of the fact that we need to think more deeply about what we mean by safety in whatever context, what we mean by harm in whatever context. And I don't find that there is that sufficient depth of thinking about it with regard to AI, that the term safety and the term security seem to be taken as self-explanatory, but more particularly the question of the social distribution of safety, who gets what safety, who is more safe than who, and how, in the case of AI, how might those differentials be either overcome or exacerbated or regulated within tolerable limits, and then how do we decide collectively in a democracy about what the tolerable limits should be. So I think that's the way I meant it, but certainly I didn't mean that we should be taking the playground example over. It's just that I happen to, for a while, have read quite a lot on children's playgrounds for some stupid reason. But it's actually more interesting because it raises a lot of these issues in a context where you wouldn't really expect it. May I add a little bit of contribution to what Lorena was saying, because I recognized in some of her answers the spirit of the Algorithm Watch contribution to the AI consultation. About looking at society and looking at impact and so on. And I think that's the end that you want to start at, rather than the end of saying, oh, here's a technology, how can we regulate it? Because it is a technology. And the thing I would add to that is that people who study innovation and so on talk about socio-technical systems, talk about the way in which those systems are invented and deployed and used in ways which have very strong socially shaped characteristics. And so that therefore we need to interrogate a little bit more about how does a particular technology come about through social processes of design, of expenditure of capital resource, of entrepreneurialism, marketing, and so forth. I mean, I see it as a kind of socio-technical or socio-economic technical set of systems. To take an example, and one thing I think a little bit deficient in the AI Act is that it doesn't really address satisfactorily the public sector very much, except to put a couple of sort of prohibitions on the use of certain technologies in the public sector. It seems to me that an awful lot of procurement of technologies in the public sector is done by people who don't necessarily have the understanding to drill deeply into the marketing pitches that are made by those who are selling stuff. And therefore, it is easy to defer to salesmanship. It's too easy to say, here we have this technology, how can we use it in whatever it is, policing and all the rest, without saying, here's the problem we want to solve. To what extent can technology contribute as an aid to decision-making, rather than investing in highly expensive, very often untried and decontextualized technological systems without realizing that it may be the wrong solution. There's a lot of solutionism going on. It's the wrong solution to the wrong problem. So I think that, you know, we ought to devote more attention to what's the nature of the relationship between the private sector who supply and design the technologies through socio-technical means and the systems that then deploy them further along, and how something gets lost in that process in terms of you know, the right solutions, if you like that term, which I don't, in terms of getting the right solution to the right problem.
Okay. Thank you, Charles. Meanwhile, another question came in, which ends in a kind of provocative question. If we regulate algorithms, shouldn't we look at any kind of human decision-making processes, e.g. in corporations and the like? Shouldn't we strive for comparable levels of transparency and accountability? Yes, of course. Should we apply learned lessons from regulating AI to regulating human intelligence?
It is very relevant, the point to make clear that with this type of infrastructure, there is the whole problem of scale that is added to human human discrimination, right? So, so the motives for discrimination from a human resources perspective can be very different depending on what type of technology is being used. But in the very end, the question remains, what is it that we are protecting? Are we trying to use a technology like that, which doesn't make sense in a context where you're trying to evaluate an individual, because you're not evaluating with this system an individual, but you are evaluating how similar this individual is to a specific range of qualities that you're searching for and to other similar profiles? And do we think this is fair? And for that, we don't need to go very deep into technology. The Bundesland in Schleswig-Holstein in Germany decided that this type of technology is simply prohibited because of that reason, independently of what type of algorithmic system in the public sector. Because if the request is to evaluate, to make an individual evaluation, then this whole system has no point in the process. And I think that this is what we need to think in terms of, if we want consistent regulation that does not collide with already existing anti-discriminatory laws and also put in place in labor, in the legal segment of labor. Because what we are going to create is different collisions. And what we are seeing in law feminist theories is that precisely we already are magnifying through law categorization many of the impact of law technologies, because we are stating that there are specific categories that are protected. And with that, this is having a massive impact on those technologies that are trying then to create those type of essentialist categories like, okay, we cannot discriminate female people, and we cannot discriminate people based on their race or religion and so on. So they start creating those categories to sort of make themselves sure that if they got into legal trouble, that they can make sure that they prove that they didn't commit any type of discrimination. So this type of regulation based on categories and that we already have in law has already a massive impact in the way how these technologies are being created, and the categories those technologies are already operationalizing, not only based on the theories that they use. For instance, if we keep thinking of these human resources recruiting technologies, they're created based on specific sociological and psychological theories. But this dimension, this legal dimension of categorization in anti-discriminatory laws, does also have an impact on how these technologies are being created. And what we see is that neither through conventional regulation nor through specific regulation towards this technology, we're going to really address the problem at stake, which is, in the very end, do we want to avoid discrimination based on power asymmetries in the way how we treat workers. And from that perspective, I think it does make sense to look for a law that is not changing every time we add new technology, because we need to think about the next technology that's going to come around the corner. It would be quantum, or it would be something else, or it would be blockchain. And what then? Should we create a blockchain strategy? Should we create a, well, there's already happened, but again, the approach is if we want to protect human rights, but also if we want to protect societal rights, which is the point of this technology, really. And in the very end, it has an impact on individuals, but based on that infrastructural approach of the technology, why cannot transform the way how we do laws and use this opportunity to think about the open homework of democratic societies and understand that societies are more than the sum of their individuals, and that there are societal things at risk that are magnified through the usage of these technologies. And as Charles said, if innovation is not about what technology we're using. Innovation is more about what processes are we changing.
Thank you, Lorena, for that. I like this kind of discussions when they get vivid in the last 3 minutes. About 5 minutes ago, Charles already raised his hand. So, Charles, if you like to give the last 30 seconds to Johan, you have another 2 minutes and 30 seconds for your intervention. And of course, okay. Daniel wants to have something. So let's be efficient in the last 3, 4, 5 minutes of this meeting. Thank you.
I'll be as efficient as I can. What I simply wanted to do was to look briefly at my very last unanswered question, which is how well are AI practitioners trained to understand social impacts? And that raises a whole question about what training, what academic training, let us say, for computer scientists, AI professionals, data analysts, and so on, what training do they get in their degree courses at universities or wherever they do it? What training are they getting? And is it soon enough in their academic curriculum to enable them to understand the social impacts of what they are doing? This is a problem that all universities are facing, my own as well, and we're wrestling with the question of how best to develop courses and curricula which would talk about ethics and human rights and social impacts and so on for people who are learning the technological skills for developing software, hardware, AI, or whatever. And it is very, very difficult. And it's a very, very long story where that kind of training and that kind of element in the curriculum always comes last at the end of the academic year or the end of the academic session, where the course organizer wants to tick a box saying, oh yeah, we've had the ethics lecture. And I say that because this Thursday, I'm giving that very last lecture in somebody's course. And I only discovered fairly recently that it is the last lecture in the software engineering course. So I raise that question because I think it's extremely important, given that technologies don't simply arise out of the woods overnight like a mushroom, but they are developed by people who need to understand what they're doing in the process of designing and implementing their techniques. So I hope that was 2.5 minutes that were worthwhile, with no answers, but just a question.
Okay, thank you, Charles. Daniel, please.
Thank you. Yeah, for last quick word. No, there are so many important aspects which we can discuss, I think, for a much longer time. Just on the horizontal regulation of AI, I previously also thought it's better to have a sectorial approach, but only after doing our research across different aspects, I realized how many points are quite equally applying to the use of AI. Which is why a horizontal tool, I think, will be helpful, as I mentioned already. Again, it is difficult to pinpoint what people are discussing under AI. We identified in the FRA report the dimensions of automation, the dimension of complexity, then the level of harm, and the level of scale. And I think these 4 dimensions help also identifying certain problems linked to the transparent use of AI. I think for a human-centric AI approach, as it's often called, it's one good suggestion is, what is not so easy in fact, is actually to never speak about algorithm decision-making in a way that an algorithm has decided something, or an AI did something, which is not that easy actually, I have to admit, but it's really important because an algorithm cannot decide anything. It's always a human who either understands what is happening or does not understand what is happening, but it's always people who decide to automate certain procedures or not. The law is, of course, obviously always behind because we first need to find the problem, and we cannot predict problems easily, so we need to wait and then react to it. That's normal, and that's okay, I think. So I'll just stop by saying there is really active policy making ongoing right now at different levels. We are talking quite a lot, not only with the EU institutions, with the others, but also the Council of Europe is very active in working on a treaty on artificial intelligence. We heard UNESCO on their recommendations, the OECD has principles and a lot of working groups. And many of these procedures are, I have to say, quite inclusive. And so I would just encourage everyone listening to actively contribute to these discussions, as it is a difficult problem we're all dealing with. And an inclusive approach of discussing the many relevant aspects is very useful and will help us further. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, David. I would like Johan to invite you for some concluding remarks.
Okay, I will try to be more optimistic, more positive in my concluding remarks. So I think artificial intelligence is not only a potential harm to human rights, but it also offers quite a lot of positive aspects. It can make our life easier, it can work for us, it can support us in work, it can make processes more efficient, less resource consuming, and for doing so, one condition would be that it's not conflicting with human rights or with legal requirements. But the second one, I think, is also an aspect that Charles had already mentioned. So security has many dimensions. It means also that we need to distribute the benefits fairly. So that's not a barrier to implement, to use technologies, because people have to feel of the jobs, of the incomes, and so on. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. As already mentioned, it is a lively discussion. It was quite interesting. We could have done that for another hour, but we are only 3 minutes late, and I would like to thank all participants, all panelists, the keynote speakers from the first session, all the people in the auditorium being with us via live stream, and as well, many thanks for the technical staff and colleagues who made it possible to have this event with people from all around Europe. Thanks for being here, thanks for being with us, and if you're interested, there are 3 more events of the PANELFIT project in the next 2 or 3 days. Thank you, and bye-bye from Vienna.